Welcome everyone to the AFA lecture 2015. It's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Woodford, this year's AFA speaker. Michael is the John Bates Clark Professor of Political Economy at Columbia University. Michael received his AB from the University of Chicago, his JD from Yale Law School, and his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has been a MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellow, and he's a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, as well as a Fellow of the Econometric Society. In 2007, Michael was awarded a very prestigious Deutsche Bank Prize in Financial Economics. As many of you know, Michael has made numerous seminal contributions in macroeconomic theory and monetary policy, and he has written the, by now, classic treatise, Interests and Prices, Foundations of a Theory of Monetary Policy. Indeed, Michael is best known for his very influential work on monetary policy, and it may come to you as a surprise that he will be speaking on something entirely different today. Michael has a new interest, important interest, research interest in a very different area involving cognitive limitations and decision-making under risk. He has written, I believe, 1 or 2 papers already on the topic. And the topic of today's lecture is cognitive limitations and the perception of risk. So please welcome Michael Woodford.
Thanks, Patrick, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm very happy to be asked to be this year's AFA lecturer. I'm in fact, of course, not a member of the AFA, and don't really claim to be an expert on finance. I was told that one of the purposes of this lecture series is to present work from outside the field that people in the finance would benefit from knowing more about, and so I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that. And in particular, I'm hoping to be able to convince you that following more developments in neuroscience may be of some benefit to people in finance. The issue that I want to talk about today is a very basic issue in financial economics, which is understanding the connection between the variability of the returns on an asset and how that asset is valued. And of course, I've got to learn that this thing doesn't work the same as my screen here. Of course, the standard approach to understanding why people value assets in some way other than simply the mathematical expected return on the asset is the hypothesis that what people care about is the expected utility that they can obtain through their portfolio choices rather than the expected value of their wealth itself, and that utility is some nonlinear function of wealth. And if you hypothesize that that utility of wealth function is concave, that would imply then risk aversion in the way that risky assets are valued, and that's an idea going back at least to Bernoulli's famous explanation of the St. Petersburg paradox. But learn to do this. But I think there are some important puzzles for that standard theory in terms of its ability to explain observed behavior with regard to risk. One simple example is that a lot of people are observed to display too much risk aversion in the choices they make about small gambles for this to be consistent with a utility of wealth function that's at all plausible as a representation of their utility of different lifetime amounts of wealth to allocate over their whole lifetime. Matt Rabin, in particular, has emphasized this in his Econometrica paper. Another somewhat puzzling observation is that risk aversion with respect to some choices coexists with risk-seeking in other cases, and it's not obvious that there's a single type of utility of wealth function that can simultaneously explain both of those types of choices. Perhaps even more puzzlingly, there are experiments, such as the famous experiments of Kahneman and Tversky that they discuss in their Econometrica paper, that show that subjects' choices when choosing between questions that involve the same probability distributions of final wealth levels, they can give different answers depending on the framing of the question. Kahneman and Tversky interpret this as saying that depending on the reference point from which those different probability distributions of final wealth levels are being evaluated, the choices are in fact different, something not consistent with simple expected utility theory. And finally, another very basic puzzle about the standard theory is that in experiments, subjects are observed to give different answers to the same choice problem when repeatedly having the opportunity to make the same choices, sometimes only a few minutes after the last time they chose. And John Hay's paper is one of many summarizing that kind of evidence. The kind of alternative interpretation of things that are often thought of as evidence of risk aversion or perhaps risk-seeking behavior that I want to talk about is that instead of attributing this to the nature of people's preferences over probability distributions over outcomes, with the idea that these preferences are applied to a precisely correct representation of what the true distributions of outcomes are when they make their choices, that perhaps instead valuations and the choices that are made between alternative options are based on an imprecise subjective representation of the payoffs that are available in different possible states. The idea is that people might, in fact, be seeking to maximize expected wealth or expected income, but they're incorrectly assessing what the average return is from a given choice. So the idea is that things that we often interpret as evidence of risk aversion might instead represent not a particular type of preferences, but a form of perceptual bias. What's useful about this alternative interpretation of risk aversion, I think it can more easily explain some of the anomalies that I just mentioned. First of all, if departures from valuing things in accordance with their true mathematical expected return is a type of perceptual anomaly, then these valuation biases could easily have either sign. There's no reason why the sign of the bias would need to always be in the same direction, and I'll explain why that is. Furthermore, the randomness observed in experiments, the apparent randomness of people's choices, can be explained as resulting from random error in these imprecise subjective representations of available rewards. And in fact, I'll talk about reasons for thinking not just the subjective representations, at least in the perceptual domain, are typically inaccurate, but that why they're typically stochastic, and so why this random error is an important part of perceptual phenomena. And finally, if one supposes that decisions have to be based on imprecise representations of the characteristics of the choice objects, then if one supposes that separate aspects of those choice objects have to be coded separately, then it's easy to get the result that different choices that are logically equivalent, although presented in different ways, should not be expected to be coded in the same way, and can be treated differently than in these people's choices. And so explanations for things like framing effects or reference dependence of choice can in fact easily result from a theory of inaccurate subjective representations. Now, I think there are some obvious types of objections that probably appear to people immediately when someone proposes to explain actual behavior on the basis of inaccuracies in subjective representations of the situation. One general kind of question is, why should we find it appealing to think that rewards are incorrectly represented in people's heads instead assuming, as economists typically do, that The brain should represent things reasonably accurately. After all, we think that we see people functioning pretty well in many aspects of life, and we might also think that there's a good theoretical reason to expect the brain to represent things accurately. You might think evolution should obviously favor accurate representation rather than incorrect representation of some kind. Another question, somewhat in the same vein, is even if you suppose that for some reason rewards are coded as some nonlinear transformation of the true quantity, and this is the kind of thing that prospect theory, for example, proposes, that people base choices on valuations that involve some nonlinear valuation function, you might think, well, even if that's what the brain represents, is this nonlinear transformation of the true quantity, why don't people learn to undo this transformation when making their choices if the evidence they have, the information they have to use to make the choice is some nonlinear transformation of the true data? You might think, again, it would benefit them to learn to do that. You might think evolution should favor their learning to use the information inside their heads in that superior way. Another question is just if we are going to allow ourselves to think that choices can be based on subjective perceptions that don't have to coincide with what the situation actually is, we might well worry that that's going to result in a theory with no testable predictions, that we can explain absolutely any possible phenomena simply by hypothesizing whatever kinds of incorrect representations of the situation we might need to make. The kind of answers that I want to propose, just to sketch where I'm going with this, is that in the theory I'm going to describe, people won't be able to learn to undo the errors, all of the errors introduced by the subjective encoding, because in the model that I'm going to propose, the subjective representation is not a deterministic function of the actual situation, but a random function of the actual situation. And in the proposed theory that I'm going to describe, I'm going to suppose that decision makers do make optimal use of the information that's available to them from this representation in their head of the characteristics of the decision problem. But because it's a random function of the true situation, the optimal decision using that partial information is not going to be completely accurate, and that's going to be a difference from, say, standard prospect theory and the kind of theory that I'm going to propose here. Another aspect of the theory that I'm going to propose is that I would like to suggest a reason for subjective representations to be imprecise, which is that it makes sense for them to be imprecise in order to economize on information processing resources. Among other things, this randomness that I just mentioned under bullet point number 1 is something that I'm going to argue is not a weird and unfortunate feature of the brain, but something that one can understand as a way of economizing on processing capacity, at least under a particular cost function for measuring what it is that the brain needs to economize that I'm going to specify. Finally, the kind of theory that I'm going to suggest is not a theory with no testable predictions. It's going to make quite specific predictions if we make the hypothesis not just that subjective coding might be inaccurate, but specifically that it has a character that makes optimal use of scarce processing capacity. So once we have some precise formulation of this capacity constraint, it's in fact going to be a very specific theory. It may or may not turn out to be right, but it's certainly not going to be a theory that is vacuous. And finally, in terms of how I think we can discipline the inquiry of this kind, I think it's important to try to develop a formulation of what the constraints on information processing are, not simply on the basis of thinking up constraints that will allow the theory to explain some of these anomalies in observed economic behavior that we're interested in, but also by trying to develop a theory that is consistent with what we know about the limited precision of subjective representations in other contexts, specifically in perceptual contexts. And the reason I want to talk a lot about perception today is because this issue of inaccuracy in the subjective representation of actual situations has been studied very extensively in a variety of perceptual contexts. And in particular, a lot is now known about how errors in visual perception arise from the nature of the neural coding of actual things in the visual field and the kind of processing that's going on in the brain. And one can not only say a good bit about what actually happens, but we now have some basis for discussing why features of visual processing arguably have the character that they do in order to economize on scarce resources, scarce processing resources in the brain itself. And I think this gives us important clues to how to develop a useful theory of the representation of economic quantities that can be of use to understanding those anomalies with regard to risk that I was referring to before. What kind of lessons from the literature on perceptual processing do I think we can get? The first of these is that it's quite generally observed in the perceptual domain that the categories into which actual magnitudes are classified by the brain are in fact fuzzy. Fuzzy in the sense that they're stochastic, that whether a given situation will be classified one way or another is probabilistic rather than a deterministic function of the actual situation. A second important lesson from this literature that I'm going to talk about is that not only are the discriminations that people can make between different situations imprecise, but sharper discriminations are made in some parts of the stimulus space than others. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to argue that it can be understood as reflecting a principle of efficient allocation of a finite capacity to make different discriminations. And finally, I'm going to argue that we can learn from the perceptual literature about the way in which the allocation of this finite capacity to make discriminations results in biases in judgment. And I'll show how that happens in a perceptual context and then show fairly directly what the analogy is from this to a possible understanding of biases in perception of average returns on risky options. Okay, so I want to start by talking about the first of those lessons from the literature on perception, which is that the neural processing, in fact, has important stochastic elements. Why is this interesting for us? Of course, standard rational choice theory implies that the choices between alternative investments ought to be some deterministic function of the state contingent payoffs promised by the investments. But in experiments, we don't, in fact, see that. Subject choices often appear to be random. The same subject doesn't always choose the same way when presented with the same options, maybe only a few minutes after the previous choice. The choices aren't completely unrelated, though, to the characteristics of the options presented. What one often observes is the probability of choice varies systematically with the characteristics of the options presented. This is a famous example of that. From a paper by Mosteller and Noji published in the Journal of Political Economy back in 1951, one of the earliest papers trying to empirically implement the fairly new theory of von Neumann-Morgenstern utility as a theory of about choice under risk. What Mosteller and Noji wanted to do was to learn what kind of utility of wealth function you needed to explain people's experimental subjects' choices over gambles. And so they would take a subject and present them with a bunch of different gambles, find out which ones they would take and which ones they wouldn't, and use that to put restrictions on what the form of the utility of income or utility of wealth function would have to be to explain the choices. This is an example of one of the gambles that they were presenting one of their subjects with. So the gamble is the subject has to pay, has the opportunity to pay 5 cents. If they take the gamble, they'll then win some amount X. If they win, they'll get nothing. If they don't win, a coin toss will determine whether they win or not, so they have a 50% chance of getting X, a 50% chance of getting 0. And the question that Mosteller and Noji want to know is, well, as you vary X, do they take the gamble or not? What's being plotted in the figure here is the fraction of the time that this single subject took the offer as a function of what X is. So on the horizontal axis is X, the vertical axis is what fraction of the time the offer is accepted or not. And what you see is that that's an increasing function. The probability is an increasing function of x. What they do with those data is they want to find an indifference point. They say the theory that we're interested in is we want to know for what value of x is the subject indifferent between this gamble and 5 cents with certainty. And they want to find the indifference point so they can map that into the von Neumann-Morgenstern utility function. And they find the indifference point by asking where on this graph does the percentage of times the offer is taken reach exactly 50%. That's how they define the indifference point. Here it's about 10.7 cents, and so they say, okay, we're going to assume the utility of income function has to imply that this subject is indifferent between 5 cents for sure and 0 cents or 10.7 cents each with probability 1/2. So that's what they take out of their data. And that doesn't seem problematic for the standard theory. That's certainly consistent with many utility of income functions. It's consistent with a somewhat concave, slight degree of risk aversion utility function. They should have been much more bothered by this figure from the point of view of the theory they're trying to test, because the theory says there should be some indifference point, and for all values of x less than the indifference point, you should never take the gamble, and for all values to the right of the indifference point, you should always take the gamble, and their data didn't show that, although they don't particularly comment on that. And so that's the puzzle for the standard theory that I want to talk about. Now, that kind of finding is in fact a very common feature of perceptual judgments. There's a literature going back to the middle of the 19th century in which experimental psychologists look at the ability of people to correctly discriminate between different situations, say the relative intensity of two lights, the relative frequencies of two sounds, the relative loudness of two sounds, which of two moving objects are moving more quickly, and so on. And they check how quickly, how often people can correctly answer these questions. They find their answers are a probabilistic function of the objective difference between the stimuli, and what's typically mapped out in that literature is what's called a psychometric function, plotting the probability of a given response as a function of the objective characteristics. And the type of functions that people typically find look a lot like what Mosteller and Noji found. This is for a particular type of perceptual experiment involving a field of moving dots, some of which are moving coherently in one direction or the other. The subject has to say whether the dominant direction of motion is to the right or to the left, and this is plotting the fraction of the time that the subject judges that the movement is more to the right as a function of motion strength to the right, which is positive if more of the dots are moving to the right, is negative if the dominant direction of motion is actually to the left, and a bigger negative fraction if a bigger fraction are moving all to the left. Mosteller and Noji, of course, were familiar with this kind of work in the experimental psychology literature, which is why I think they didn't even particularly comment on the puzzling feature from the standpoint of economic theory of the experimental data that they had found. Now, this randomness in perceptual judgments is a familiar feature in the experimental psychology literature. It can be understood as resulting from randomness in the neural processing of these stimulus characteristics. And so I want to talk about a particular example of that related to this moving dot experiment that I just showed. And a lot of the work that measures very carefully what's going on in the brain, in the case of perceptual processing, has been done with rhesus macaques. And so this is some of the areas of the macaque's brain that are involved in visual processing. I'm going to be talking about measurements of a couple of these regions. The MT region, I don't know if this thing works. Well, anyway, you see it there sort of in the middle of the screen, labeled MT, the middle temporal region. In that region, there are known to be neurons that are sensitive to particular directions of motion in the visual field, neurons that will fire only in the case of moving objects moving in a particular direction. I'll talk a little later about the V1 region, where neurons are found to be particularly sensitive to edges with a particular orientation, one or another tilt, again, in the visual field. But right now I want to talk about the area MT. So what is being plotted here are histograms of the number of spikes produced by one of the neurons in this middle temporal region. In the case of a monkey who is solving this perceptual task of having to classify the moving dot stimuli as either dominant direction of motion to the right, dominant direction of motion to the left, the monkey gets juice if he makes the correct judgment, and so with training he gets good at understanding the task and doing it. And the measurements are being taken of how many times this neuron produces an electrical spike while he's contemplating this question. The different histograms correspond to different degrees of coherence of the moving dots. So in the bottom, only 0.8% of the dots are moving coherently in one direction or the other. In the middle, 3.2% of the dots. At the top, 12.8% of the dots are all moving coherently in one direction and with the same speed. The white histograms are the frequency distribution of different number of times the neuron spikes when the motion, dominant direction of motion, is to the right. The black histogram is when the dominant direction of motion is to the left. This particular neuron is one that's classified as being sensitive to movement to the right. How do you see that? You see that because that histogram in the white histogram moves further to the right, larger and larger average number of spikes being produced, the greater the degree of coherent movement to the right. Different degrees of coherent movement to the left are not changing the probability distribution very much. Something I want you to notice about this is that the response of the neuron is quite random. There's substantial dispersion across different trials that are observed in the number of spikes that the neuron produces, even when a similar stimulus and the same task is being undertaken. Now, if one asks, suppose this is going on in the brain of the monkey, and asks what an optimal decision rule would be. Optimal from what point of view? Suppose the goal is maximizing the probability of correct classification and therefore maximizing the amount of juice that you'll get from the answers that you give. Suppose the decision has to be based on particular available evidence from the neural coding, namely, suppose the available evidence is the number of spikes produced by a right-sensitive neuron and also the number of spikes produced at the same time by a left-sensitive neuron. And if the dominant direction of motion is to the right, we're going to interpret the number of spikes produced by the right-sensitive neuron as a random draw from that white histogram, and the number of spikes produced by the left-sensitive neuron as a random draw from that black histogram on the previous slide. So now we have a theory of the probability distribution of different neural representations of the situation, given what the degree of coherence of the motion in the stimulus is. If we also assume a particular prior, the prior is going to be that it's equally likely in the environment that right and left motion are the right answer, then we can ask what the optimal decision rule would be, and in this case it would be simply to choose right if and only if the number of spikes produced by the right-sensitive neuron is bigger than the number of spikes produced by the left-sensitive neuron. Under that rule, we can now make a definite prediction about the probability distribution of responses that you should observe by the monkey in the case of each of the possible stimuli. Okay, and here they are, the white dots in this figure labeled neuronal. That's the prediction of the fraction of times the monkey should be able to get the answer correct as a function of the coherence of the movements of the dots if the decision is based on the rule that I just described using the evidence in the brain that I was proposing, given those histograms from the previous slide. The black dots show, in fact, the fraction of the time that this same monkey, from whom the neural data is being recorded, does get the answer right. And one sees a fair ability of this model of the monkey's choices to explain what's going on. And so it seems that observable randomness in the neural coding does have a reasonable ability to explain the nature of the observed randomness in the relationship between the actual stimulus and the classification that's being made by the monkey. Now, to extend this to a more complicated case, I'm going to have to extend the formalism a little bit and to apply this to something like valuing a continuously valued payoff on an asset, which is not just a binary classification. I need to talk about how we can extend this to judgments about continuous magnitudes, but there's a lot of study of that in the perceptual literature as well. A case that I'm going to talk a lot about is judgments of the tilt of lines that can be tilted more clockwise or more counterclockwise. And if you ask a subject to make a judgment of which of two sets of lines are tilted clockwise relative to the other one, this is something that requires you to classify the stimulus not just as yes or no something. There's a continuous range of different possible degrees of tilt that the stimulus could have and that the brain is going to have to be able to classify things as. And there are neurons that are sensitive to that, particularly in the V1 region that I mentioned before. But what one observes is not that these neurons respond to the presence or absence of a single very specific orientation, because orientation is now a continuous variable. They respond differentially to different magnitudes. And you can describe this mathematically and using experimental data by plotting what's called a tuning curve for one of these neurons. So what's done experimentally, this is now one of these cells in the V1 visual region, is you can record how many spikes the neuron produces when presented with a stimulus, say a group of parallel lines in the environment with one tilt or another, and you can plot the number of spikes produced as a function of the orientation of the visual stimulus. And what's done is then you can estimate a Poisson rate parameter given that sample distribution for each of the orientations. The blue curve then plots that, and you can plot then this tuning curve indicating the cell's degree of responsiveness to the different stimuli. So given a tuning curve of that kind, which in principle we can measure for each of a population of cells, in the part of the brain that's processing this type of feature of the visual environment. And under the assumption that each neuron spiking is going to be an independent Poisson process with the rate parameter given by that tuning curve, you can then derive conditional probabilities of different patterns of neural activation for each possible value of this continuous stimulus feature, say for each possible orientation of the stimulus. From those likelihoods and from some prior then over what the possible orientations can be, you can define an optimal estimate based on the pattern of neural activation, and from that you could then derive a theoretical set of conditional probabilities for subjective judgments about the feature as a function of any objective value of the feature. So then, if you have a particular hypothesis about when, say, stimulus 2 would be judged to have an orientation clockwise relative to stimulus 1, suppose it's whenever the optimal estimate based on the random neural representation R2 is bigger than the optimal estimate based on the random neural representation R1, if on a given trial theta hat of R2 is bigger than theta hat of R1, then under that hypothesis you can derive what the probability of giving that response is as a function of the true theta 1 and theta 2, or you could plot it as a function of the true theta 2, fixing the orientation of the reference stimulus, and you can get a predicted then psychometric function in the case of judgments of this kind about a continuous variable, and again it would have this continuous upward sloping character of the kind that I showed you before. So we could use this kind of theory to explain the occurrence of psychometric functions of the kind that Mosteller and Noji measured in cases where the judgments that are being made are about continuous magnitudes, the subjective coding of, say, the processing that you get if you win in the case of a particular gamble. A question that this theory lets us ask is, if this is the interpretation of what's going on in their experimental data, is it in fact legitimate to conclude that the indifference point that they identified in the way I showed you on the graph from their paper does in fact identify a gamble which is of equal value under the preferences of the decision maker? And that's something we could actually answer under a theory of how the different probabilities of responses are being produced in the case of different true payoffs when you win the gamble. And the answer is going to be not necessarily, and I'll explain that, but I'm not going to explain that directly. That should become clear later in the talk, why this theory, which would give you a way of modeling not just the average choice made by the subject, but also the random variation and the degree of random variation in the case of different gambles, will allow us to reach a definite answer about questions like that. I want to go on to my second lesson from the literature on perception. And this relates to the question of what we know about how this neural coding, this population distribution now of tuning curves varies in the case of different types of continuously distributed magnitudes. You might think I've proposed a type of theory which is interesting, but it sounds like it has a gigantic number of free parameters now, and so we need something further to discipline what kind of predictions the theory is going to make. And so I'm going to talk about some things that are known in various perceptual domains. And what one observes is that the precision of discriminations in a given sensory domain is typically, is at least often, not constant. It can vary with the magnitude, with the true value of the feature that you're asking people to discriminate. And the way of measuring this in the psychophysics literature is to measure what's called a discrimination threshold. So you can ask, by how much should this continuously valued feature have to vary in magnitude for people to get the question of comparing two magnitudes right 75% of the time. That's essentially a way of measuring how steep that psychometric curve is in the middle part of the curve. So you can measure that. When you measure it, you find that it's not necessarily independent of what the reference magnitude is that you're comparing other magnitudes to. And theoretically, in the kind of model I just sketched, it can be explained by the nature of the distribution of tuning curves across a population of neurons, and in fact, experimentally, one can test whether that's true, again, by doing these actual measurements in the brains of animal subjects. And I want to suggest, furthermore, that things that we know about the distribution of tuning curves can be viewed as reflecting a problem of efficient allocation of scarce processing resources. So this is, again, the idea of a tuning curve. Am I going in the right direction? No, I'm not going the right direction. Sorry, okay. So here is here's a well-established example of the thing I was just talking about, which has to do with judgments about orientations. People don't make perfectly accurate judgments about whether one set of lines is tilted clockwise or counterclockwise relative to another set of lines. But something that's observed both in people and in various animals is that they can make sharper discriminations between different orientations when they're nearly vertical or nearly horizontal, and that we're not as good at making judgments about relative tilts between different oblique orientations. And that's something that has been called the oblique effect. There was an important survey paper back in 1972 by Opel that gives that name to this very well-established experimental finding. Where is my slide? There it is. So here is an example from a recent paper in Nature Neuroscience by Gershik, Landy, and Simoncelli. They're plotting this discrimination threshold in the case that the reference orientation has different angles indicated there. The blue dots with the whiskers are the experimental data. And what this shows is the discrimination threshold is much lower, around 0 degrees, around 90 degrees, around 180 degrees. And the discrimination threshold is about twice as high, around 45 degrees or around 100 and around 135 degrees. Furthermore, measurements of the V1 region of the macaque's brain show that this difference in ability to make discriminations can be explained by the allocation of greater processing resources to some of these types of judgments rather than others. How is it measured? Again, by measuring the tuning curves of individual cells in the V1 region. A couple of measurements that people report. One is to identify the preferred orientation of the cell. That's that dotted line labeled PO. You look where the response in number of spikes per second is highest and call that the preferred orientation of that particular cell. A second thing to look at is the tuning width, indicated by TW there. You ask, how different does the orientation have to be for the spike rate to fall to only 50% of its maximum level? And that's a way of measuring how wide or narrow the tuning curve is. What's found when people do that for a bunch of different cells in the V1 region is that they find that there's a larger number of neurons with preferred orientations that are near vertical or near horizontal than there are neurons with preferred orientations that are oblique angles. And they furthermore find narrower tuning widths for neurons with preferred orientations that are more nearly vertical or horizontal. So this is a demonstration that that feature of the population distribution of tuning curves can in fact explain the variations in discriminability that I showed you before. What Gershik, Landy, and Simoncelli are actually interested in doing in that paper that I mentioned, where they measure the discrimination thresholds, is they take a mathematical model where you have the heterogeneity in the number of cells with different preferred orientations that are experimentally measured, with the heterogeneity in the width of the tuning curves of the different cells, depending on what their preferred orientation is, that's experimentally measured. And whereas the prior, they use the frequency of occurrence of different oriented edges in the natural environment as the prior, and they ask, under a Bayesian observer model, what the predicted discrimination threshold should be. And I want you to look at the darker gray, but not the darkest black line in this figure from their paper. That's the one that gives the prediction of this model using these environmental frequencies as the prior. So this is a theoretical model with no free parameters to fit the experimental data. No free parameters. And it does a pretty good job of explaining, in fact, those variations in the discrimination threshold. Okay, so that's a mechanical, at least, explanation of what's going on. I'd like to suggest that it can be viewed furthermore as an efficient use of the available resources, given the fact that both in natural and certainly even more in man-made environments, like where we are right now, there are a whole lot more horizontally and vertically oriented edges than there are oblique orientations. So you look around the room, you see lots of horizontal lines, you see lots of vertical lines. So we operate in an environment where there's a lot more reason to be good at recognizing those orientations than the exact difference between different degrees of tilt. So this is the environmental frequency distribution of different oriented edges that Gershik and co-authors in fact find when they analyze a database of natural scenes, and you see these spikes in the frequency around the vertical and horizontal orientations. A recent dissertation by Deep Ganguly, that I'm actually taking this figure from, points out that that frequency distribution of orientations lines up very well with the frequency distribution of preferred stimuli of the different cells in the V1 region. That's what the panel on the left is showing. It also lines up very well, but inversely, with the variation in the discrimination thresholds that the experimental evidence shows. So it seems there's support for the hypothesis that this environmental frequency of different orientations is directly determining both the distribution of preferred stimuli of the different tuning curves and the resulting differences in discrimination thresholds. He discusses similar regularities in a bunch of other sensory domains. I don't have time to show you more of his figures, but what he shows is that in quite a few different sensory domains, there's evidence of this kind of adaptation of the perceptual coding to the frequency with which different stimulus features are occurring in the natural environment. What he shows across these domains is the density of cells tuned to a particular value of the stimulus, varying in proportion to the frequency with which that value occurs in the environment, discrimination thresholds varying inversely with the frequency, widths of the tuning curves varying inversely with the frequency. And I'd like to suggest that this can be explained as an efficient use of scarce processing resources under a particular view of how you should formulate the limit on processing capacity. And the reason I'm interested in this is because I want to propose this as the cost function to then take to other contexts, including economic contexts. So just to tell you what the definition of processing capacity is that I'm going to talk about, if for a given objective state X, we have a probability distribution of possible subjective representations, that's that P sub X, then we have a collection of those conditional probabilities that describes the overall random coding system. It also defines a communication channel in the sense of Shannon's information theory. And so then there's a definition that we can take from information theory, which is the definition of the processing capacity of such a channel. It's basically a measure of how different these different conditional probabilities of responses are from one another. And then using that measure of the thing that there's an upper bound on, the regularities that Ganguly talks about are in fact consistent with the hypothesis that the neural coding of each of these features of the environment is organized so as to minimize average uncertainty about the state of the world. If we measure average uncertainty by the entropy of the posterior distribution, given the information revealed by this current neural activation pattern, if we suppose that the neural coding minimizes that objective, subject to a constraint, namely some finite upper bound on what the channel capacity of the processing network can be. And I think I probably don't have time to talk about really why this is the solution to the constrained optimization problem. So maybe I'll go ahead. But say that the further conjecture that I'm interested in as a result of this result is that perhaps in the case of economic decision making as well, decisions are going to be based on subjective representations of the available options that we should assume are going to be efficient subject to an upper bound on the required channel capacity to implement that subjective coding system, and this efficiency will always have to be judged relative to a particular frequency distribution of possible choice situations, which will be an important part of the kind of theory that I'm going to talk about. So before I turn to the idea of an economic application of that, I want to mention one more lesson from the literature on perception, which is that optimal judgments will typically be biased even when they make optimal use, in the sense I've been talking about, of random perceptual coding of the kind that I've been talking about. So of course there are a lot of well-established biases in perceptual judgments, but a number of these can be explained as resulting from correct Bayesian inference if you suppose the Bayesian inference is being based on a noisy subjective coding of the stimuli that are being presented to the subject. The example I want to talk about is again about judgments of orientation that I've already talked some about. So I've pointed out that Gershik and co-authors measure discrimination thresholds for orientation. They show subjects two stimuli. The stimuli are a bunch of patches in which there are bars of light and dark bars oriented in some direction. And they ask of these two stimuli which is more clockwise in orientation. Now they can go beyond that simple version of the task, and they can consider the case where one of these stimuli has a uniform orientation in all the parts of the visual field, whereas the different patches have different orientations in the other stimulus. And they can ask people which of them is oriented more clockwise on average. So this is what their stimuli look like. The AL for lower variability is the case where all of the patches have the same orientation of the light and dark bands. The H for higher variability, you'll notice that the local orientations are different. They're not all the same. There's some variation around the average tilt of those patches. And the question is, when you see two things like this, that you have to judge which one is on average clockwise relative to the other one. Now, that allows you to measure a certainty equivalent, uniform orientation, corresponding to any of these variable orientation stimuli. That's not the term they use. That's the term I'm using to suggest to you why this has something to do with finance. So you have the variable thing. The tilt is in fact variable. In truth, you're asking people to judge what it is on average. You can ask what constant case would be equivalent to that variable stimulus, equivalent in the sense that when presented with the two choices, people are equally likely to think one of them is more clockwise relative to the other one. Okay, and the answer is the certainty equivalent is not equal to the true average of the orientations. And we can measure the bias, the difference between that certainty equivalent and the true average. It's not zero, but the interesting thing is it varies systematically in a way that's common across subjects, and that's a sort of systematic pattern. So the data on the left is one subject. The data on the right are averaging 5 different subjects, and you see that even when you average them, you see a clear pattern here. When the orientation on average is between 0 and 45 degrees, the bias is negative. When it's between 45 degrees and 90 degrees, the bias is positive. When the bias is between average orientation is between 90 and 135, the bias becomes negative again. When it's between 135 and 180, the bias becomes positive again. So there's alternation between positive and negative bias occurring in a systematic way that's the same across all these subjects. You can describe it as saying that the bias is always toward the nearest cardinal orientation, either toward the vertical or toward the horizontal, whichever of those is closest to what the true average orientation is. Okay, those biases is not just an interesting fact about what people answer to that question. They're in fact consistent with optimal Bayesian inference if the judgments of orientation have to be based on imprecise stochastic coding of the kind that I've just been talking about. So I've already described a little bit what the theory is like. The predicted average estimate under this optimal Bayesian theory, that expected value of theta hat conditional on theta, is given by this integral that involves this function phi of theta tilde conditional on theta. That's the average posterior distribution over estimates theta tilde associated with a given true stimulus, and so we can define that given the conditional probabilities and given the prior that follow from the neural coding scheme that I described before. In the case that you have the regularities that Ganguly was documenting in the various perceptual domains, it turns out that there's a nonlinear transformation of the state space under which the prior is uniform, and when you transform the state space in this way that makes the prior uniform, this conditional distribution of subjective representations is then invariant under translation, which is an important property, so we can write it just as a function of the difference between omega and omega tilde. I can then make a prediction about what the average estimate is going to be as a function of the true orientation. Now, in terms of this G function, which is measuring how precise, how tight the posterior is in the case of any given true orientation in that transformed state space, and the F, which is that nonlinear transformation. And so what you can see is it's the nonlinearity of that nonlinear transformation that was required, that accounts for the biases in the average estimates. If the function F is linear, there would be no bias. It's the nonlinearity of F that accounts for the biases. Under the particular nature of the neural coding that Ganguly documented that I was talking about before, when you do this calculation, you get a prediction that this function is going to have this characteristic. It's going to imply zero bias at the cardinal orientations, zero bias midway between the cardinal orientations, but a positive bias between 0 and 45, negative then between 45 and 90, positive between 90 and 135. Negative between 135 and 180. This is not the bias that I showed you before. This is saying someone who's observing one stimulus, which has a true orientation theta, what on average is going to be their perceived estimate of the orientation. That's what this expected, on average, this expected value of theta hat. That's not something that was being observed in that experiment that I showed you before, but Tomasini and co-authors have a recent paper that try to directly measure this thing. They have an experiment where people look at similar stimuli and they require them to line up dots that are on the edges of the screen so that the dots are lined up with what the subject perceives the average orientation of those other patches to be. And so you can directly elicit from them their estimate of the average orientation. And here's what the biases look like. And so it has exactly the alternating pattern that I showed you, the theoretical prediction about the optimal Bayesian inference given the nature of the neural coding. Now, the further thing that we're interested in to explain about the bias in the nature of the certainty equivalence and how it was different from the true average orientation. Suppose now, instead of one orientation in the stimulus, we have a collection of patches, each of which has an orientation, local orientation theta I that can be different. And suppose the average orientation of this collection is going to be estimated by the average of the subject's optimal estimate of the orientation of each patch. That estimate of the orientation of each patch is going to be based by on the theory that I gave you before. So then we can define our certainty equivalent orientation in terms of the function, little function e of theta was that average expected value of theta hat, conditional on theta. That's what I'm calling e of theta. Using that e of theta function, we can define the certainty equivalent, and in general, it will not be the same as the true average of the local orientations. The bias can be clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on the local convexity or concavity of the function e of theta. I showed you the function e of theta. You saw that it alternated between being concave and convex, so the predicted bias now in the certainty equivalence will alternate in sign, and now this bias is going to be toward the nearest local cardinal orientation, which is what the experimental evidence showed. And in fact, jumping forward to Gierschik and co-authors' paper, this is again, the prediction of their Bayesian observer model with no free parameters. This is the prediction now about the bias in that certainty equivalence measurement experiment. And again, the line of greatest interest is the darker of the gray lines, not the solid black line. And that's the model with no free parameters. It does a pretty good job of explaining the nature of that alternating bias. Okay, so I want to talk about how similar principles could be used to explain biases in valuations of risky prospects as implications of efficient coding of aspects of the choice situation. And the example I want to talk about is reference dependence of valuations of risky prospects, as in the classic paper by Kahneman and Tversky. So one of the experiments they talk about is one where subjects are given the following problem. In addition to whatever you own, you've been given 1,000 Israeli shekels. You now have to choose between two choices, A and B. You either can win an additional 500 with certainty, or you can take a gamble that gives you 1,000 more with 50% chance, but a 50% chance of winning nothing. Another problem they presented their subjects with was similar form but different numbers. In addition to whatever you own, you're given 2,000 Israeli shekels. Now you have to choose between choice A, you'll lose 500 with certainty. Choice B will be probabilistic. You'll have a 50% chance of losing 1,000, 50% chance of losing nothing. They report that a majority of their subjects, substantial majority of their subjects, choose A in the first problem, choose B in the second problem. That's, of course, disconcerting, right, to all teachers of choice under risk, because the problem for the standard theory, it's not just a problem for expected utility theory, it's a problem for any theory that says choices should be a deterministic function just of the probability distribution over final wealth levels, because the probability distribution over final wealth levels in choice A and choice B are the same in both cases in those two problems, yet subjects more often do one thing rather than the other in the two cases. And of course, Kahneman and Tversky's proposal is that people don't evaluate only the distribution of final situations. They say evidently they care about the distribution of gains or losses relative to a reference point, which they hypothesize is the wealth you have at the time that you have to make the choice between A and B. The interpretation I want to propose is that this reference dependence arises as a feature of the way the objective characteristics of the choice situation are being mapped into subjective representations that are then the basis of the further processing of the decision making. And you might say, well, okay, I can get reference dependence if I assume reference dependence in the subjective coding, but I'm going to argue that this reference dependence can be a feature of an efficient coding scheme due to constraints on information processing capacity. So I don't get to just make up whatever I want about what funny features it might have. So what's the proposed model of efficient coding in this experiment? I'm going to suppose the decision maker is going to have to make a judgment about the relative value of these two options, A and B, after first receiving some initial amount W. So those are the data that they're going to have to represent. So we can represent the situation entirely by three numbers for each situation: the initial amount W, the amount you'll get in the good state. If you choose a given option, the amount you'll get in the bad state. If you choose that option, in both cases, you can suppose the two options are equiprobable, so we don't have to represent any probabilities. I'm going to suppose that what the decision maker cares about is only picking the option with the highest, leads to the highest expected final wealth. And specifically, I'm going to suppose that the efficient coding problem is to produce an estimate of the relative value that minimizes the mean squared error of that estimate of the relative value. I'm going to suppose that you have to estimate the relative value on the basis of subjective representation of the choice situation, which has 5 elements corresponding to these 5 numbers that describe the true choice situation. So I'm going to suppose that you have to separately code each of these 5 numbers and represent them in some way mentally for separate processing. The fact that they have to be coded separately is going to be important for allowing logically equivalent situations not to turn out to be equivalent as a result of inaccuracy in the subjective coding. So there are going to be separate observation processes determining conditional probabilities of each of these elements of the vector R, describing the subjective representation, conditional on one of the elements of the vector of W's and X's that describe the true attributes of the choice situation. I'm going to suppose those objects are all chosen efficiently, subject to a constraint on the precision of the coding, which is going to be a finite upper bound on the sum of the processing capacities used for each of those subchannels to code each of those attributes. I'm going to suppose it's just the arithmetic sum of the Shannon capacity of each of the channels is the thing that has to be within some finite upper bound. What do I conclude about the nature of efficient coding? Well, first, an efficient coding scheme, if I define the problem that way, is going to be one in which 0 processing capacity will be allocated to more accurate encoding of the amount that you're initially given, because that's in fact irrelevant to your calculation of the relative values of the two options. So no processing capacity will be used to represent it. Therefore, the choice will have to be a function only of your subjective perception of the distribution of gains or losses. I now get that as a conclusion of efficient coding. That doesn't by itself explain why choice wouldn't be only a function, though, of the true relative expected value, and that true relative expected value is still the same in both problems. So there's still a mystery about why the subjects give different answers in the two cases. Here's the further and less trivial implication of the efficient coding theory. For each of these state contingent payoffs, X, that has to be coded, there's going to be a set of conditional probabilities of different subjective representations of that attribute, conditional on its true value, that are chosen to solve this particular kind of minimization problem that will be the same for each of the attributes. You want to minimize the mean squared error of the optimal estimate given the subjective coding of the attribute, subject to an upper bound on the Shannon capacity of the channel required to implement the coding. Given a finite upper bound on that channel capacity, the efficient coding is then going to make the optimal estimate on average a nonlinear function of the true value of that payoff X, and this is what the nonlinear function will look like for different values of the assumed upper bound on the Shannon capacity. If there's 0 Shannon capacity, you have the horizontal line in the middle. You just should always estimate it as the prior mean, regardless of the true value of the payoff. If you have an infinite Shannon capacity, you get the straight line that's the diagonal. You can perfectly discriminate exactly what the payoff is in every possible state. For any finite positive value, though, which is the case of interest, it's a sigmoid type function. It's steepest in the middle, flatter around on the edges. This is like the function I showed you, the E of theta function earlier, in the case of the average estimates of orientation, which, if you remember, was steepest around the cardinal orientations, flattest around the midpoints between the cardinal orientations. The cardinal orientations were the things that occurred most frequently under the prior. Here I'm assuming a Gaussian distribution for the true values of this attribute X. So this 0 relative to the prior mean, is the peak of that prior distribution, and we're getting the steepest part of this function in that region where there's the most probability density, as we observed in in the perceptual context. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to jump ahead. I think you can probably see where this is going in terms of risk aversion or risk-seeking behavior. Now in terms of the two choices, Kahneman-Tversky's first problem is going to be valued like those blue dots up there. We're choosing between a gain of 0 and a gain of 1,000, with each with probability 1/2. The average valuation of those two things are given by the two blue dots, and the average of those averages is the dot labeled B. Instead, the average valuation of getting 500 with certainty is going to be where the blue dot labeled A is, and that's higher because of the concavity of this function in that region. On the other hand, the convexity of the function in the region of losses makes the average sign of the average bias flip in sign, just like the sign of the average bias was flipping in sign at different parts of the stimulus space in the case of the orientation judgments. And here we're able to explain exactly what Kahneman-Tversky observed. The prediction is that the choices should be probabilistic, not that subjects will always choose the same way, but they should more often value certainty higher in the domain of gains, more often value the gamble higher in the domain of losses. Since I'm used a lot of time, I think I'm going to jump ahead to the conclusions that I propose to draw from this. I think that various features of observed choice behavior may all be explained by the hypothesis that decisions are based on imprecise subjective coding of the features of the choice situation rather than exactly correct representations of the choice situation. For example, in the Mosteller and Noji experiment that I started with, this kind of theory can explain both the continuous psychometric function rather than discontinuous, jumping from 0% chance of taking the bet to 100% chance of taking the bet at some single value of the payoff, and also can explain why those experimental subjects would be more likely to reject than to accept in the case of a fair bet, not from assuming that they are genuinely so risk-averse as to not be risk-neutral even in the case of bets that only involve 5 to 10 cents, which is actually a strange assumption about utility of lifetime wealth, but instead because of this risk aversion of the apparent risk aversion resulting from biases in the perceptual processing in the domain of gains. And we can explain both of those things as consistent with the hypothesis. The subject is in fact always choosing the option that has the higher perceived expected value to them at the time that they're making the decision. We can also explain how non-negligible risk aversion in the case of small bets, like those really small bets in the experiment I just showed you, could coincide with only modest risk aversion in the case of much larger bets. The answer here would be that if in different contexts people process these numerical magnitudes differently in a way that is efficient for each of the two contexts, the efficient processing should involve nonlinearities that depend on the probability distribution of magnitudes that you expect to encounter, which will be very different in settings where people are making decisions about large amounts of money and settings where they're choosing small bets like in the experiment. Under that hypothesis, you should expect the range where the nonlinearities kick in the biases to be different in those different settings. As I just showed you in the Kahneman-Tversky experiment, we can explain both risk aversion in the domain of gains and risk seeking in the domain of losses, consistent with the same hypothesis about what's determining the decisions that the decision maker is making. And in fact, under the hypothesis that I proposed, the decision maker is actually always trying to choose the thing with the higher perceived expected monetary payoff. This is where I can answer the question I posed earlier about whether Mosteller and Noji were making a correct judgment about the preferences of their subjects by identifying the indifference point in the way that they do. Under the interpretation that I'm proposing, the answer is no. There is a bias in their judgment. One can explain their data as being consistent with the subjects actually being effectively risk neutral in the case of those small bets, although they were concluding otherwise from the figure that I showed you. Does all of this matter? For the bigger problems of finance, I guess I'd like to encourage you to think that if imprecision in subjective coding does have non-negligible behavioral consequences, one
thing that implies that the welfare evaluation of financial regulation shouldn't be based on the assumption that what people choose is necessarily what they actually value most. And I think that that has, may have very important consequences for thinking about financial regulation. It implies not only that we may expect people to make mistakes, but furthermore that the set of available contracts that we might expect to evolve in the marketplace may well evolve to exploit tendencies of people to make predictable mistakes. And if so, that would be important to think about. To try to develop a theory that could actually be used to answer questions about regulation, of course, we need to develop an empirically validated theory of the errors that result from imprecise perceptual coding. I've tried to give you a little sketch of what such a theory might be like, but this is a long way from the completion of that program. I do think, and I'd at least like to suggest to you, that advances in understanding the neurophysiology of perception may be one of the sources that we should look to for guidance in theory development in this area. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike, for this extremely stimulating and thought-provoking, wide-ranging lecture on a difficult subject where I imagine we have little familiarity as finance scholars. I guess our cardinal orientation is not quite the same as neuroscientists and psychologists. But I think the big ideas that you're trying to suggest are pretty clear. I mean, at least one of the takeaways I took from your lecture is that risk perceptions depend a lot, and preferences, risk aversion, depend a lot on the context and familiarity with certain types of risks. So I thought that was one of the major takeaways of what you were saying, which then, of course, brings in a much richer set of considerations that we usually bring into our models. But anyway, I have some thoughts, some questions, but we have a little time, and Mike kindly offered to take some questions. If you have any, anyone who has some questions, if you could please step to the microphone and thank you, Mike.
Hello. Sorry for my accent. I spent a couple of years in Brooklyn and the accent stuck. I enjoyed tremendously your lecture, very stimulating. Although I have to admit that towards the end I got the Migo syndrome, my eyes glaze over. But I want to ask you the following question. Imagine yourself that all these things are systematic. Each individual player has these biases. Now, imagine yourself that you allow a market in which you trade what is the true answer, okay? And each person has like a penny, and he either wants to make a bet or he has to give up the penny to somebody else to make the bet. So what I suspect may happen is people will either develop better skills or they will develop methods to guess, and the ultimate result in the market could be that the market prediction is precisely what the orientation is.
So first, one thing I'd like to point out about the kind of theory that I'm proposing is that it's not a theory that implies that while you'll observe mistakes at the individual level, you should expect that if you aggregate the independent judgments of a large number of people, the errors should therefore cancel out, and so that there shouldn't be consequences, at least for aggregate pricing. And that's absolutely not a consequence of the the kind of theory I've presented. And as I pointed out, that's one of the reasons for stressing the fact that there's a probability distribution of erroneous estimates
that will occur for the true value of whatever the characteristic is, but that the average value, the mean value of that distribution of individual estimates that should occur on different occasions for one person or should occur across the population if a bunch of people are independently trying to make the same judgment, the average of that is in general not the same as the true value. So there's certainly no tendency of, if in a market you're averaging the independent judgments of a large number of people, for that to solve the problem. Now, if you're suggesting that there might be technologies that could help make the truth of the situation more easily visible to people, I would say, of course. And indeed, if you ask, why does accounting exist and things like that, the answer is, well, because it matters how you present data to people, right? I mean, whether they will more correctly or not be able to sort out what's going on matters. It depends a lot how things are presented, and it's been important social progress to develop better ways, and we constantly, of course, have to think about ways to do those things better, but we have professionals that are trained to help other people do a better job. But first, I think, understanding at least why those functions matter rather than assuming that people would automatically see things correctly is perhaps important for making judgments about the necessity of, say, having accounting standards or not, and things of that kind. But also, I think that while technology can help mitigate the problem, and it does, and it's an important problem, but one that we certainly, many highly paid professionals do work on trying to help circumvent. I think that just casually assuming that the market must somehow arrange for the right amount of information to be presented to largely solve individuals' problems isn't obvious, because you have to ask what the incentives are of the people who could, in principle, produce more accurate information. And so I'm not going to deny that there are ways to make information more salient and more available, but you do really need to think about what the incentives are for the production of that better information, and again, what kind of perhaps regulatory framework you need to have in order for those incentives for the desirable amount of information to be being made more visible.
How should we think about learning in this model? Should we think it's Bayesian learning, or perhaps we're going to devote, like if we repeatedly make such decisions, we're going to devote more capacity to particular problems that are showing up?
So the problem of learning is a very important problem, and I didn't say anything about it because I thought I had a sort of a complicated enough thing to talk about with showing you the set of experimental results and some reference to theoretical calculations that I was already showing you. Since I said that the optimal coding should be adapted to a particular environment, that certainly raises the question of how that process of adaptation occurs, and it would depend on how much experience the subjects have had with a given environment, and when the environment changes, there's an obvious question of how quickly the learning is going to occur and how successfully, and certainly you shouldn't think that the people will immediately have the optimal coding for some new environment as soon as the environment changes. There is interesting evidence suggesting that the coding, say for orientation that I was talking about, I don't have that slide with me here, in this presentation, but a type of experiment that's been done. I showed you how the orientation threshold varied with what the orientation of the lines were that was the reference orientation that you were comparing some other lines to. I just showed you an average for a particular experiment. Another type of experiment that I didn't talk about is one where you have the subject stare at lines with a particular tilt for a while, and then you do this experiment where you measure the orientation thresholds of other tilts again. And the orientation threshold curve moves. You don't have to have them look at a particular stimulus too long to then have a measurable effect that shifts those orientation thresholds. How does it shift them?
the orientation threshold becomes lower around the type of orientation that you've exposed them to a lot, and it gets higher for other orientations further away from it, which is consistent with a learning process where you say, well, if you're learning that in your environment this type of orientation in fact occurs more often, then the optimal coding should adjust to a different prior. It's an updated prior, and you should expect the changes in the orientation threshold that are measured to occur. Now, that doesn't tell you exactly how best to model that learning. You could think of it as a type of Bayesian learning. You could think of it as various other types of adaptive learning, but that adaptive learning of some kind does occur, and indeed reasonably quickly enough for that itself to be a phenomenon that we should be interested in, I think is demonstrated in perceptual contexts and is likely to be relevant in economic contexts as well.
My question was similar to Gustavo's questions, Mike, but I wanted to push it a little bit further. So I can imagine a situation where an agent is facing, say, a dynamic problem and is, looking at a particular set of stimuli, and the stimuli, varying within a certain range, and he says, well, I don't change my optimal coding, I don't change, they look very similar to me. And all of a sudden, they change continuously, or they cut a threshold, essentially, and then the guy processes again in order to save on capacity. I'm wondering, this is going to have very strong implications in economic models, essentially, because it's going to lead to a lot of discontinuities. Are you thinking about these type of problems? You see what I mean in terms of...
Yes, I believe that they're very interesting and important. That's different from saying I know too much of what the ultimate answer is going to be. But again, I think there's very interesting work in the perceptual literature and in the computational neuroscience literature dealing with that question. There are experiments on, say, people's ability to forecast what's going to happen next when the probability generating function changes discontinuously at points in time, and you look at how their forecasting changes in response to that. And what these studies have found is not just that people are able to change the way they forecast relatively rapidly, because it seems that they start learning once the distribution changes. People, and you have some outliers I observed that makes it clear that something surprising has happened, they start learning in a way that pays a lot more attention to the most recent observations than was true previously. And there have been a lot of studies showing physiological correlates of this that are trying to measure which parts of the brain are more active when the subject shifts from thinking they're forecasting in an environment that they're used to one where something surprising has occurred and they're now having to pay close attention to re-optimize. I'm saying re-optimize, of course we don't know if it's some mechanical thing happening in the brain, but you can interpret it as re-optimizing the parameters of your model of your environment because you realize that something has changed. And so I think yes, the direction I see this developing is hopefully toward a better understanding of how people do respond to surprising events when part of what happens is recognizing that a model of the environment that they've been acting on the basis of looks like it's suddenly not so likely to be right, and how I think what we see is relatively abrupt changes in behavior, types of changes in behavior that are not consistent with many of the types of learning models in the economics literature, which there were the old adaptive expectations models in the 1950s where people just forecast using some moving average, which if you average very much past data, then the forecasts change very slowly. And there are more sophisticated versions of that in the least squares learning literature or the Bayesian learning literature, but typically the kind of models people have used in the economic literature on learning have been ones where you hypothesize there's some true distribution, which is unchanged over time, data generating process that's unchanged over time. There are a few parameters that you have to estimate from experience, but you're updating your estimate of those parameters in a relatively continuous way over time. And once you've had some experience, you're not changing your estimates very much with each new data point. And those kinds of models of learning have trouble, I think, explaining a lot of observed behavior, including observed behavior in economic experiments, where it seems that when the environment changes, people learn in a way that involves picking up on the change more rapidly than these simple econometric models of learning do. And again, I think that studies that are going on of perceptual processing may provide important insights into how to develop a more realistic class of models, which among other things will account for the way the learning process can change relatively abruptly when you become aware that something sufficiently surprising has just happened.
Hi, my name's Karsten. Thank you very much for this lecture. It's pretty dense. I think it's going to take a while to sink in for me. And I have two questions, one more specific, I guess, and one more general. When you were talking about prospect theory, did I understand that correctly, that you said we shouldn't spend any cognitive processing power on the reference point and just think about gains and losses? Because a lot of the literature that tried to implement prospect theory has been thinking about, well, what's the appropriate reference point, you know, like the average of wealth or previous consumption or, you know, along those lines. And are you proposing that we should only look at gains and losses, or did I misunderstand that? And the second more general question would be, where do you think the bounded rationality literature is agreeing with you, or what would be examples where you think that kind of strain of the literature is working along your lines? Thank you.
Okay, so with regard to the question about whether it's important to try to understand what the determinants of reference points are, I would say, well, yes, of course it's important. I mean, this is a type of theory that tries to give an interpretation of, you know, why there might be a reference point. And I'm not saying that the general version of the theory is that it's simply gains and losses. In the classic experiment, of course, that was Kahneman and Tversky's hypothesis, was that in that example, the relevant reference point was the level of wealth when you're choosing, so that gains and losses correspond to payoffs relevant to the reference point. And I was presenting a theory which would make that a natural result. It would explain why would that be the reference point, which I think follows from the way the data are being presented to the subjects, you know, that they're not presented with the data about the final levels of wealth that they can have with different probabilities if they choose A and B. They're told, you get 1,000 shekels first, okay, now you have them, now you choose A and B, you'll get different amounts. You know, that's the form in which the data was presented. Then a fairly simple theory about what the cost function is can easily lead to reference dependence of that particular kind. That doesn't mean that in more general contexts, other types of reference points, you know, aren't relevant. In general, the type of theory that I'm sketching implies that the neural coding is going to be relative to a particular context, and I was suggesting in particular you should think about this in terms of the coding being relative to a frequency distribution that you get used to encountering or expect to encounter in that context, which is what, with respect to which a particular coding would be efficient. And so I think that likely the right kind of theory is not one that thinks actually there's a reference point. It's really this reference distribution. It's where you are relative to that environmental distribution that you've encountered or come to expect that is actually probably in general the relevant notion, but this is definitely a theory that's trying to say what should determine relative to what the coding occurs, and certainly it implies that that would be different in different contexts, and that you should recognize that it's likely to be different in different contexts. And as Patrick was saying, I think one of the big implications of this general line of thought is exactly that you should expect choice to be context dependent, you know, very typically. You should always be aware of that possibility. It's trying to give a suggestion, though, what kind of context dependence you should expect to find, rather than just saying, well, any aspect of context can always change anything, which, you know, then that starts sounding like a theory that's, again, going to have no predictions. This is trying to suggest a particular line of explanation about how and why particular aspects of the context should affect coding. But yes, you should be looking for that context dependence, and I think that's what people mean when they talk about figuring out what is the reference point in a particular kind of situation and what determines it.
Just on this latter point on context dependence, I wanted to make two remarks and hear your thoughts on them. So first remark relating to financial crises and theories of financial crises. A name that has come up a lot, an economist that has been forgotten and now his writings have been revisited in light of the crisis, is Hyman Minsky. And Hyman Minsky, if you read what he says about how booms develop and how they lead to crisis, it's very much a story of context, familiarization with new contexts, which then change perceptions of risk. So that's the first comment I wanted to make, see what your reaction is on, relative to the theory you're trying to develop. The second comment is something that relates to your remark about learning and attention. And there's this very famous Harvard experiment that's been replicated many times with the monkey in the room, where you ask the subjects to focus on something like, how many times was a ball exchanged among players in a room, and then when they focus on that, they don't see the monkey cross the room. But then you tell them after the fact, actually, there's something big that you missed, then they pick it up, which is very much, I think, in line with the way you're thinking about the learning. It's like there's cardinal orientation drives decision-making, but realization that the orientation has changed, that you need to refocus on what's cardinal, will give you these sudden changes in learning.
No, I think that's right. So the general type of theory that I was suggesting here, I think is very much in line with the experiments that show that people can be surprisingly unaware of something that you might think would be a very visible part of the environment when they have a reason relative to the task they've been assigned to be focusing on other aspects of the environment. And this idea of a limited amount of processing capacity that could be allocated to more accurate representation of different aspects of the situation, this idea that it was this sum of the processing capacities that were used to represent different features of the environment that had to not sum up to more than a finite quantity, that kind of cost function can easily lead to it being optimal to allocate no capacity at all to representing many features of the situation. And I gave a relatively trivial example of that here, where I talked about it being optimal not to pay any attention to what the experimenter says is the amount of money you're given before you're presented with the choice between A and B. And that might seem obvious because it was irrelevant, but in fact, even when things are a little bit relevant, you can easily have a corner solution be optimal under the kind of cost function I was referring to, and there are many aspects of the situation that it's of a little bit of value to you to be aware of. It can be optimal to, in fact, not be paying attention to them at all. As to the relevance to finance, I think exactly what you were saying earlier about, say, Minsky's financial instability hypothesis is very much the sort of reason why I think we need to think more about this type of theory. I think that after the things that have happened in the last decade, that we're very much aware, both here and in the case of the European crisis, we're very much aware of the fact that we can have situations where markets look very quiet. The valuations that many people are applying evidently indicated that some kinds of risks were barely being thought of at all, and then suddenly at a later point in time it turns out that something was simply not being looked at, that if it had been, paid attention to would have looked much more alarming. And I think, trying to understand, well, why and when do people pay so little attention to some features of the environment is likely to be an very important issue exactly for those reasons. I didn't answer, I guess, the second question that had come from the back, which is about, does this have anything to do with bounded rationality? And I guess I see it as part of what one could broadly call the bounded rationality programming. Bounded rationality is not just one theory. It's a sort of it's a willingness to entertain a broad class of types of theories, and I see this as belonging to that. One of the types of theories that it's especially closely related to is rational inattention theory. And if I'd had more time, I would have talked more about why it's not exactly the same as the way Chris Sims has proposed to develop a theory of rational inattention, but it's definitely a close cousin of Sims's theory of rational inattention. It has some elements in common with an idea Xavier Gebex has been developing a lot recently, what he calls sparseness of coding. He wants to hypothesize that people will in fact represent only a few of the attributes of a situation instead of all of the elements of a long vector. And again, this theory can easily result in sparseness of that kind being a feature of the optimal coding. It doesn't hypothesize exactly the same kind of cost function that he's proposed, but it's clearly a related idea. And work by people like Bordelot, Genaioli, and Schleifer on their salience theory is also trying to accomplish something that is I think very closely related to what I'm trying to do. I'm proposing a particular structured theory of what should be expected to be more salient and less salient, that is not mathematically equivalent to their proposal, but again, I think we're trying to do very similar things and starting from very much the same initial insights as what we're trying to do.